Hi, welcome back to the Healing Medicine Show. I'm your host, Dr. Blair Thielemier. This show is produced as part of the Healing Medicine newsletter. The vision for this show is to provide healthcare professionals with resources and inspiration for personal and professional development practices, especially those that are rooted in holistic health. We believe that the change in healthcare starts by focusing on the health and the healing of the healthcare professionals. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Amy Reichelt. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Good to be here.
So we're going to dig into your background. You've got a PhD in neuroscience. You've done extensive research in the area of neurobiology, specifically with a focus in nutrition. Now you're working in the pharmaceutical industry, specifically in the specialty of psychedelics, and we're going to dig into that. But first, I want to start off this interview by asking you the same question we ask all of our guests, which is, what does healing mean to you?
I think that it's having the quality of life that you expect and want. So I think that for many individuals, that if they have mental health struggles, or their physical wellness isn't where they think it should be. I think that your mind and body are very much, to me, connected, and mental health and physical health really do go hand in hand. I don't believe that you can have physical health and without mental health, and vice versa. So it's really, in the same way that you're saying, it's a holistic wellness issue, and that, to me, really, it is having that mind-body connection, social connection, grounding, just being one with yourself, and feeling whole as a person.
So, I come from pharmacy, so the world of pharmacy, and we're taught a lot about the intricate link between the brain and gut connection. And because you've studied both the brain and gut, I think it's very interesting to first, I'd love to explore a little bit about what is neuroscience, and what is the neurobiological link between the mind and the body.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was always fascinated with was kind of why we were driven to eat certain foods, and how our biology, our brain's biology, really encourages us to want to eat certain things that tend to not be the healthiest, because we have almost this reward drive towards these highly palatable foods, and these highly palatable foods tend to be high in fat and sugar. And I found it so fascinating that as we've moved through time and evolution, that our brains haven't changed structurally and neurochemically since we were effectively living in caves and hunter-gatherers. But now we're in this environment where it's just replete with delicious foods all the time. And for so many people, this has caused them changes physically and also mentally, and understanding that link between potentially increases in obesity rates, but also going hand in hand with mental health. So one of the things that I was working on in an academic setting was really around how a poor diet, which again has this high saturated fats, high refined sugars, was capable so fast, within the space of a week, of effectively altering memory and how people are able to form memories. And this was conducted in animal models. However, if we take that rodent, our rat doing its maze that it gets confused in because its hippocampus, the area of the brain that forms memories, is very prone to aspects of neuroinflammation and its required neuroplasticity, that this is so rapidly altered by a poor diet. And then also thinking about how so many people consume these diets across their whole lifespan, and how potentially there is an a drive for young children to seek out these very rewarding foods. It's really tasty. And when you become an adolescent, these are the things that are available to you because they're cheap and easily accessible. How this could then be potentially rewiring or derailing the maturation of the brain to then cause long-lasting changes in how your brain actually functions. And then when we look at it again, when we potentially start speaking to our healthcare providers and they're saying, well, you have high cholesterol, your blood pressure's up, you've got to do something about your lifestyle, your BMI is too high, you have too high body fat percentage, that then it's so difficult to make those lifestyle changes. And what is actually then underpinning why we can't make those lifestyle changes? It's our brain. And that is our neurochemistry, our neurobiology is shaped by our experiences. It's shaped by our environments. And that's not just the world that we live in, but the food that we put into our bodies. And we're starting as scientists are starting to discover, more and more about the gut microbiome and how that is, again, changing aspects of neurochemistry through the microbes in the gut. They live on what you feed them, which is your diet. And the colonies of your gut microbiome are altered because, in the same way that you can't plant a cactus in peat soil, it will die, or, that it's what lives there and it's what it's fed. The food in your gut is effectively the fertilizer for this microbiome. And again, starting to understand how this gut-brain connection via signaling between the vagus nerve or potentially through neuroactive chemicals being released from the microbiota into the bloodstream that can then enter into the brain and alter perception, how you feel, your mood, like anxiety. There's so much to it. So I think that our ideas around our lifestyle and how it influences our brain and our mental health is just an utterly fascinating thing to try to understand and research. But it's really at the forefront of medicine because so much medicine just, again, is you feel sad, you have depression, take an antidepressant, not you have depression, maybe adjust these lifestyle factors, start to look into the core reasons as to why this is why you're feeling that way. I'm not disparaging the use of antidepressants in situations that there are other lifestyle changes that may augment the effectiveness of these drugs, and also so people can get off them quicker and not be reliant on them and handcuffed effectively to having to take certain pharmaceuticals for potentially long-term periods.
Yeah, it seems like a continuation of a cycle. So what I'm really hearing there is when our microbiome in our gut is the unhealthy microbiome is flourishing, it creates a little bit of a feedback loop to our brains that makes us crave more of those sugar, high fat type of foods. And it kind of continues to perpetuate that overgrowth. And so for the attendees who are listening that are interested in functional medicine, this will make sense for sure. Some of the stuff that I've studied is the effect of something like a proton pump inhibitor. So we've got lots of patients who have gastric reflux, but instead of focusing on dietary change, we introduce a PPI. So everyone is on this PPI, but realistically, we haven't studied it for long-term use. So it's changing the pH of our stomach. It's changing the absorption of how we're absorbing certain building blocks, the amino acids that are the building blocks for the serotonin. They're building blocks for the norepinephrine and the dopamine and the oxytocin and all of those neurotransmitters. And then naturally, we see kind of a decrease of the the ability to build that. I did back in, 2017, I did a genetic test on myself and found out that I was homozygous for an MTHFR mutation, which essentially prevents me from methylating folic acid and B12 and a lot of the neurochemicals that we need to make the serotonin. So the idea of having an SSRI, for example, introducing an SSRI to prevent the reuptake in the synapse doesn't really make sense if your body's unable to make the serotonin and you're still, I remember in pharmacy school, someone talked about you're not deficient of an SSRI. You're deficient in the neurotransmitter. So focusing on, what you talked about, this neurobiological response to what you're introducing in your body, it is a difficult cycle to break through. But as we're seeing in neuroscience, there's some interesting new applications in the world of psychedelic medicine that helps kind of interrupt this cycle and this default mode. So how do you, I guess, kind of, there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about that needs addressed in healthcare, but I'd love to hear more about your journey from studying neurobiological responses for nutrition to psychedelic medicine and the mental health space. How do the two connect, and how do we begin healing our broken healthcare system?
Yeah, so my journey has been it's definitely not linear. I was really interested in how our brain's neurochemistry is altered by diet, and what a lot of it comes down to is this balance of making sure that our brain has the right amount of neuroplasticity and also preventing neuroinflammation or systemic inflammation in the body. And our research and many other people's research has really pointed towards unhealthy diets causing neuroinflammation and low levels of systemic inflammation that then infiltrate into the brain. But that's also seen in so many neurodegenerative disorders and neurological disorders, as well as psychiatric conditions like anxiety and depression, that this sort of underlying inflammation then has a very much downstream effect on our brain's function and a negative impact on our mood. And beyond that as well, we know that when the brain is inflamed and there is alterations to neurotrophins, like neurotrophic factors, like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, is reduced again by having a poor diet, or people with obesity and inflammation. And this also knock-on effect to individuals who have, say, mild cognitive impairment leading to dementias, that there's this importance of plasticity in the brain. So that really underpins a broad number of conditions, and not just using lifestyle and diet, poor diet as a model, but that is then seen in numerous other mental health conditions. So I was really intrigued when I started hearing about the use of psychedelics, which are 5-HT2A serotonin agonists, for mental health conditions. And I mean, what I was really struck by initially was the ketamine literature that started arising, showing that ketamine, which isn't serotonergic, it's an NMDA antagonist, and that these doses of ketamine are able to promote neuroplasticity, and potentially that is one of the routes by which they're able to start to treat mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. It's when it coupled with psychotherapy, it's almost like just having like a super powered psychotherapy session, which you're putting the brain back into a more plastic and malleable state, so that then you're able to integrate in these learnings and experiences and new concepts of how to think with the treatment paradigm. So augmenting it really with the psychedelic experience. And when you think about the classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, they've been used really throughout millennia, really. Well, not so much LSD, but the psilocybin.
Ergot. I mean, we see mentioned
Roman times,
ergot. You know, that if you study medicinal plants, especially in the ancient times, psychedelics are there.
Yeah, but so ancient times, these are effectively the classic psychedelics are ones that are derived from plants, and breeding from that then in the 50s and 60s, where they were started to introduce into psychiatry, and then obviously they were banned, and that the sanctioning of psychedelics just really put a massive halt on their application in a more westernized medicalized setting, and thus they were just banned. And there's still a rich amount of literature there suggesting their effectiveness, and then the excitement being that I think in the last decade that people have started to acknowledge that there's more understanding about how the neurobiology and neurochemistry. We've got brain scanning technology and techniques that are able to tap into understanding a bit more what these psychedelic compounds are actually doing to the brain, and then also harnessing that into the psychedelic assisted therapy protocols that are proving to be, at least in initial clinical trials, effective for a number of different mental health disorders, so including treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorder, alcohol use disorder, smoking cessation. So there's numerous applications that even extend beyond just a standard psychiatric condition of depression or anxiety. And that, I think, is really exciting and potentially paradigm shifting. I think that particularly with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, so many people became deeply affected by what happened, be it through illness themselves, through the colossal shifts in people's day-to-day life, and thinking back to how we were 2 years ago or 3 years ago, like it was crazy times. It was something that
it was very traumatic.
Yeah, and the trauma that people experienced through the pandemic, I think it's brought to light mental health, and people want to talk about it more because there is this shared experience. I think everyone can reflect upon what happened. Nobody was not affected. Nobody can really sit there and say, it was fine. My job was fine. Just everything was still carried on basically as normal. I don't think anyone is in
on earth. No one on earth, I think, can say that.
And I think that that's paradigm shift there, that so many people have been affected by it and are continuing to be affected by COVID-19. And I think that has definitely put an urgency in mental health care, that people are like, well, 30% of people don't respond to SSRIs. And when you start looking at statistics of somebody who's become depressed or anxious because of what has happened to them, that they want more, and people want to be able to take control more of what has happened and control of their mental well-being. I think that this dialogue is really, really urgent and vital, and it's called for this shift. And I think that psychedelic has demonstrated this sort of light at the end of the tunnel, in a way, providing another way of potentially healing for individuals who may be in a situation where other accepted forms of medicine, so SSRIs or psychotherapy alone, haven't proven to be useful to them or as effective as they want it to be. But it's having that additional option available, and I think that that's one of the most promising things in psychiatry, and also potentially in neurology, because we're starting to understand more and more about how these molecules are, the 5-HT2A receptors are involved in neuroplasticity and reducing potentially inflammation systemically or in the brain, and that we're starting to understand more about the biology of these compounds, which could then potentially be harnessed to treat other disorders, which are potentially everything from IBS, where you have gut inflammation, to like potentially cognitive impairments or cancer survivor, people experiencing shifts in their life and understanding how to prevent themselves or stop smoking or stop drinking as much alcohol. These sort of massive shifts. It's providing another way potentially to treat these disorders or conditions that people are experiencing.
I love what you said about taking control. It allows us to take control of the choices that we're making, but also to be aided in, if we're facing a decrease in the amount of serotonin and dopamine and things in the brain, and really looking at neuroinflammation. So part of the genetic testing that I did said I was at a high risk for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And I thought that was very interesting. I have a paternal grandmother who passed away from Alzheimer's and a maternal grandmother who is currently suffering from Parkinson's disease. So when I saw this high risk for those neurodegenerative diseases, that kind of was my beginning to look into, well, what are the choices that I can make now to decrease my risk of developing neurodegenerative diseases in the future? When I found that this MTHFR mutation, that it kind of led me down this new path and looking at all of the applications of psychedelic medicine, everything from post-traumatic stress to opportunities in addiction to immune suppressant. It's also, I think, going to raise the question for a lot of healthcare professionals. So this audience is a group of nurses, doctors, pharmacists that are going to be using these modalities in their practices, maybe even as early as next year. So we're seeing MDMA in phase 3 clinical trials right now for post-traumatic stress disorder. What I think I'm most excited about, and the idea behind it, is that post-traumatic stress disorder, I think I've always kind of connected it with veterans. And when I started reading more about it and getting a better understanding of trauma, more trauma-informed care, I guess, is kind of the idea. It's something that a lot of women deal with in their lives, whether it's a history of sexual abuse or it's the trauma of the pandemic. So I have quite an interesting pandemic story. I was actually pregnant for all of the pandemic and delivered in October of 2020, and that was very scary. It was around the same time of the Zika virus, and we didn't know if the COVID virus, we knew so little about the COVID virus that I didn't know if I needed to quarantine for the entire 9 months of my pregnancy. So there was a lot of fear around that for me. So I think it's this idea of taking control, because what I'm hearing from pharmacists particularly, this is more my industry, we were on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. We were the ones that were doing the screenings to test patients whether they were positive or not in the very early days. A lot of those screenings were being done in pharmacies. And then when the vaccination came out, pharmacists are responsible for administering about 80% of the vaccinations that were given in the United States. What we're seeing now is those frontline healthcare workers, the nurses, the doctors, the pharmacists, everyone who's involved in that, in the frontline efforts during the pandemic, are struggling. they're struggling a lot. And because we have this background in healthcare, we kind of think, well, I should be able to figure this out myself. I should be able to get through it myself, or whatever that looks like. So, in closing, for that healthcare professional that is interested in learning more about the opportunities in psychedelic research, and just getting a better understanding for where they're at in their mental health journey, what are some resources that you can share or point them to, that may be helpful for getting more comfortable with psychedelic medicine, as it's going to be something that we're going to be in charge of ordering and prescribing and dispensing and administering as early as 2024?
Yeah, I think that, firstly, it's at the moment, psychedelic drugs are still Schedule 1. So that's one thing that's, there's going to be a logistics around even the prescribing of these compounds and the drugs, because they are still technically scheduled, and that becomes a difficulties around even the prescribing and then the administration of these drugs. So I think that's going to be something that healthcare professionals are going to have to really sort of start to understand and recognize that there is going to be a lot of red tape and paperwork. And then I think that there's so much interesting science out there. It's almost overwhelming seeing some of the papers coming out and manuscripts, research coming out every week. There's so many new studies and different modalities, whether it be brain imaging studies or whether it be clinical trial results coming out. It's and then also the basic science of the drugs and how they're altering the neurobiology and understanding that in animal models. It's overwhelming in a way, because there's just a constant influx of this information. There's psychedelics today. I've always thought is really interesting, and has podcasts, but also there's numerous resources out there for having kind of those digestible understanding of what the literature is, and having it explained in a much more understandable way than going deep dive into the science, which can be dense. I think that there's conferences coming up, the MAPS psychedelic science.
Psychedelic science. I'll be there. Will you be there?
I hope to be there, and I think that will be there, and again, that will be a massive forum to start to see the professionals in the space and the names who are really at the forefront of the research and the clinical trials, and starting to understand what's going on. I think that it's such a fast moving state at the moment as well. I am obviously really hopeful that the clinical trials for all the companies who are investing into these clinical trials are going to go well, but also that understanding the design around the trials, making sure that what they're actually studying and the results that are coming out are robust is also so important as well. And I'm very much a proponent for the use of these psychedelic drugs, as I think they're game changing in potentially psychiatry and for neurology, but also making sure that the clinical trials have been run to a stringent degree and have the results behind them to back up that when these drugs hopefully become FDA approved and they move from their phase 3 trials, that they're not going to continue to have any adverse effects, and understanding how these drugs can work in different populations, as you were saying, with doing a genetic test. We know that there's numerous polymorphisms and genetic changes in different people that could potentially alter how these drugs are metabolized. And I think that's why it's important that a range of psychedelic drugs are being studied currently. It's not just psilocybin or psilocin, LSD. People are looking at DMT, 5-MeO DMT, moving into mescaline and the phenethylamines that also there are next generation compounds being investigated as well, which potentially don't have the psychedelic aspects to them. I think these psychoplastogens are so exciting as well, and that, potentially taking the hallucinations out of, removing the trip from a psychedelic. And people are, currently, on the fence about whether or not this is really going to be therapeutic, but also it can open up the gates to people who might not be able to access these drugs because they may have psychiatric indications that would prohibit or limit the use of something that could potentiate any sort of psychosis. So I think that the field is moving. The first generation is imminent, but I think that understanding more and more about the neurochemistry and the neurobiology of these drugs and the next generation drugs that are going to be developed is going to open up further and further into the potential accessibility. And also that the clinical trials must really be run in a stringent manner to allow then people to potentially access these and be prescribed them, and for people to be able to use insurance to be able to access them, because currently it's the access is vital, and making it so it is affordable for people, and that also psychiatrists and neurologists and the medical providers are comfortable with prescribing these, because it's going to have to go through this medical way to allow these people who really need these drugs the access to these drugs. And it's understandable that there's the potential to go on a retreat, but it is expensive and it's out of pocket, and so many people can't access that. And I think that having these drugs accessible is going to be a game changer and really important in terms of psychiatry and neurology.
Absolutely. I think, in pharmacy, we always talk about evidence-based medicine. And so it's really exciting for me to see some of the clinical trials moving forward that's showing the data around the efficacy, the safety, and the judicious use of these medicines. So I really appreciate it. This has been a fantastic conversation. What's the best way for an attendee who's watching the show to connect with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Amy Reichelt. My website's amyreichelt.com.
Well, thank you. We will definitely link to your LinkedIn profile here and then share your website in the show notes. So access is such a huge piece of this, and I agree with helping healthcare professionals become comfortable with a class of medicines that were, in my pharmacy school, essentially skipped over as no medical use. So we know Schedule I, no medical use. So the idea that we're creating evidence for the medical use to reclassify some of these medicines and be able to access them through specialty pharmacies and through local doctors, and it's so exciting, because I do feel that that's a piece that that we are going to be seeing probably in the next 5 to 10 years, that we're going to have firsthand experience at dispensing and distributing these medicines. So it's a very illuminating conversation, Amy, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us here today on the Healing Medicine Show.